"You can't come in here looking like that, old man. This is a place of history, not a shelter." The words, sharp as shattered glass, struck Elias Vance with a physical force, making the 87-year-old man flinch almost imperceptibly. He stood at the polished marble entrance of the newly inaugurated Valor and Sacrifice Wing of the National Military History Museum, his thin, threadbare coat offering little defense against the chilling disdain in the young attendant's voice. His eyes, the color of a faded sky, held a flicker of pain, a deep weariness that settled into the lines etched around them by time and hardship. He clutched the worn strap of his canvas satchel, its contents a secret history he rarely disturbed. The vibrant, almost aggressive modernity of the museum lobby, with its soaring ceilings and hushed reverence for polished displays, seemed to magnify his own shabbiness, his own apparent insignificance. He had traveled 2 days by bus to be here, a pilgrimage of sorts, drawn by a whisper of a promise that a piece of his long-buried past might be enshrined within these walls. Now he was just an inconvenience, an unsightly blemish on the pristine face of commemoration. If you believe every hero, seen or unseen, deserves a measure of respect that transcends appearance, type honor in the comments below. We need to hear you. Elias Vance had been a whisper himself for most of his life, a quiet man who moved through the world with an unassuming grace that often rendered him invisible. His small, meticulously tidy apartment on the outskirts of a forgotten town held few clues to the firestorm he had walked through in his youth. There were no medals on display, no framed citations, only a single faded photograph on his nightstand of a group of young men in ill-fitting uniforms, their faces alight with a mixture of bravado and trepidation. A lifetime ago he had served, like so many others, when the world was engulfed in flames. A paratrooper with the 101st Airborne, a screaming eagle who had dropped into the blood-soaked fields of Normandy, fought through the frozen hell of Bastogne, and witnessed horrors that still haunted the edges of his dreams. But those days were ghosts, locked away. Now he was simply Elias, the old man from Unit 2B who kept to himself, whose highlight of the week was the half-price breakfast at the local diner, the new Valor and Sacrifice Wing he'd read in a tattered newspaper clipping, was dedicated to the very campaigns he had endured, the very men he had fought alongside. A specific mention of artifacts from the siege of Bastogne had pulled at something deep within him, an urge to bear witness, to see if their story, his story, was remembered correctly, remembered at all. He wasn't seeking glory, only a quiet affirmation that the sacrifices made in the crucible of war had not entirely faded into the mists of time. He carried not bitterness, but a profound, enduring ache for a world and for comrades lost. The museum, he hoped, would be a place of solace, of connection. He approached the ticketing counter, his worn boots making soft, apologetic sounds on the gleaming floor. Behind it, a young woman, Chloe, barely out of her teens, impeccably dressed in the museum's stylish uniform, was scrolling through her phone. She looked up, her bright, professionally courteous smile faltering slightly as her eyes swept over Elias. "Yes? Can I help you?" she asked, her tone a carefully calibrated blend of politeness and dismissal, the kind reserved for those who clearly didn't belong. Elias cleared his throat, the sound raspy. "1 ticket, please, for the Valor and Sacrifice exhibit." Chloe's perfectly sculpted eyebrow arched. "That's our premium exhibit, sir. Tickets are $50. She paused, letting the sum hang in the air, her gaze lingering pointedly on the frayed cuff of his jacket. "Perhaps the general admission exhibits would be more suitable for your budget." The implication was clear, wrapped in a silken veneer of condescension. Elias met her gaze, his own expression unreadable, betraying none of the sting her words inflicted. "No, thank you, young lady," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "I've come a long way specifically for the Valor and Sacrifice Wing." He began to reach into his coat for his worn leather wallet, the simple act seeming to take an immense effort. His movements were slow, deliberate, the stiffness of old wounds and older sorrows weighing him down. He wasn't accustomed to defending his intentions, his worthiness. He simply wanted to see, to remember, to feel. Before Elias could produce his wallet, a new voice, sharper and more officious, cut in. "Is there a problem here, Chloe?" Mark, the floor supervisor, a man in his late 30s whose uniform seemed a size too small for his burgeoning self-importance, strode over. He cast a cursory, dismissive glance at Elias before focusing on his subordinate. Chloe, relieved to pass the perceived problem up the chain, replied, "This gentleman insists on a ticket for the premium wing, Mark. I was just explaining the cost and suitability." Her voice dripped with shared understanding. Mark puffed out his chest slightly. Assuming an air of authority, he turned to Elias, his expression hardening. "Look, pal," he began, the familiarity intentionally disrespectful. "We maintain a certain standard here. This is a prestigious institution. Frankly, we've had some issues recently with vagrants attempting to use the museum as a shelter, especially with the colder weather setting in. This isn't the place for that." His eyes raked over Elias again, cataloging the signs of poverty, the weariness, and drawing all the wrong conclusions. The accusation hung heavy in the air, thick with prejudice. Elias felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach, a sensation he hadn't felt since a lifetime ago, facing a different kind of enemy. "I am not a vagrant," he stated, his voice still quiet, but a new edge, a sliver of steel, had entered it. "I am here to see the exhibit. I have the money for a ticket." He held out a slightly trembling hand, clutching a $50 bill. Other patrons in the queue behind him were beginning to notice the confrontation. Whispers rippled through the hushed lobby. Some looked away, embarrassed. Others watched with a detached curiosity, or worse, with expressions that mirrored Mark's judgment. Mark ignored the proffered money, his stance becoming more confrontational. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to leave the premises. You're creating a disturbance." Elias stood his ground, a sudden, unexpected surge of resolve stiffening his spine. He wasn't a young man anymore, quick to anger. But this dismissal, this casual cruelty, touched a raw nerve, a sense of duty to memories he held sacred. "I will not leave," he said, his voice low but carrying a surprising weight. There's a display in there about the 101st, the Ardennes campaign. Sergeant Frank Miller, my friend. His photograph is supposed to be in there. I need to see it." His voice cracked slightly on his friend's name, a momentary lapse in his stoic facade that revealed the depth of his purpose. Mark scoffed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Oh, an expert on military history, are we? Now claiming to know people in the exhibits? That's a new one." He smirked at Chloe, who giggled nervously. "Sir, your personal anecdotes are not our concern. Your presence is unwelcome. Please leave now, or I will be forced to call museum security to have you forcibly removed." The threat was delivered with relish. Elias closed his eyes for a brief moment, a wave of profound weariness washing over him. It wasn't just about seeing a photograph anymore. It was about dignity, about the quiet sacrifices that seemed to count for nothing in this bright, sterile world. He felt the gazes of the onlookers, the weight of their judgment. He felt so utterly alone. He opened his eyes, his gaze distant, as if seeing beyond the polished walls, beyond the disdainful faces, to a frozen forest, to the faces of boys who would never grow old. He simply stood there, a silent, unyielding sentinel of a forgotten war. The air crackled with unspoken tension. Mark reached for his radio, his face flushed with irritation and the petty thrill of exercising his minimal authority. "Security to the main lobby? Premium wing entrance. We have a situation." Just as Mark's thumb hovered over the transmit button, the hushed atmosphere of the museum lobby was pierced by a different kind of authority. The sleek automatic doors slid open with a soft whoosh, revealing the arrival of a distinguished entourage. A gleaming black sedan, small flags mounted on its fenders, had pulled up to the curb. From it emerged a tall, imposing figure in the immaculate dark blue dress uniform of a United States Army 4-star general. Stars glittered on his shoulders. Rows of metal ribbons adorned his chest, testament to a lifetime of service and command. This was General Marcus Armstrong, chairman of the Joint Chiefs, a man whose face was familiar from news broadcasts and whose presence radiated an undeniable aura of power and gravitas. He was scheduled for a private pre-opening tour of the Valor and Sacrifice Wing, an event the museum director had been anticipating with a mixture of pride and anxiety. Accompanied by a discreet aide, General Armstrong strode into the lobby, his sharp, intelligent eyes taking in the scene with a practiced sweep. He immediately sensed the undercurrent of conflict, the knot of tension around the ticketing counter. His gaze fell upon Mark, whose hand was still on his radio, then to Chloe, looking flustered, and finally to the still solitary figure of Elias Vance. The general's brow furrowed. "What seems to be the trouble here?" he inquired, his voice calm but resonant, cutting through the charged silence like a blade. Mark, startled by the sudden appearance of such a high-ranking officer, visibly blanched, his aggressive posture deflated instantly. "General Armstrong, sir, we weren't expecting you for another hour," he stammered, fumbling to regain his composure. It's nothing, sir, just a minor disturbance. This man, he was refusing to leave the premises." The general's gaze, cool and appraising, shifted back to Elias. For a long moment, the two men looked at each other. Elias, old, weary, and disheveled, met the piercing eyes of the 4-star general, and in that gaze, something shifted. A flicker of recognition. Then disbelief. Then dawning comprehension in General Armstrong's eyes. He took a step closer, his attention fixed solely on Elias. General Armstrong's aide made a move to intervene, to perhaps steer the general away from the unsightly civilian issue, but Armstrong raised a hand, silencing him without a word. He continued to study Elias's face, the lines, the faded scar near his temple, the set of his jaw that even under the weight of years held a hint of stubborn resilience. "Excuse me," the general said, his voice softer now, directed at Elias. "Have we met before?" Elias, surprised by the direct address from such an august figure, could only manage a slight, uncertain shake of his head. He didn't recognize the decorated general, but the general was looking at him with an intensity that was unnerving, yet strangely familiar. Then Armstrong's eyes widened almost imperceptibly. He leaned forward slightly. "Sergeant," he asked, his voice dropping to a near whisper, freighted with an almost incredulous hope. "Sergeant Vance? Elias Vance, from the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, Baker Company, 2nd Platoon?" Time seemed to stop. The sounds of the lobby, the whispers, the distant city hum, all faded away. Elias's breath caught in his throat. That name, that designation. It was a key to a locked room in his soul. He looked up, truly seeing the general now, searching his features. And then a ghost of a memory, a much younger face, perhaps a fresh-faced lieutenant he'd once. He nodded slowly. A single, profound affirmation. "Yes, sir," Elias managed, his voice barely audible. "That was me." Instantaneously, General Armstrong's entire demeanor transformed. The inquisitive, powerful officer vanished, replaced by something else entirely. He straightened to his full, formidable height, his back ramrod straight, his hand snapped up in a salute, so crisp, so imbued with respect, it seemed to echo in the sudden, deathly silence of the museum lobby. "Sergeant Elias Vance," General Armstrong declared, his voice ringing with emotion and profound deference. "It is an overwhelming honor, sir." Mark and Chloe stared, mouths agape, their faces draining of all color. Patrons gasped. The world had just tilted on its axis. General Armstrong held his salute for a long moment, his eyes locked on Elias, conveying a depth of respect that words could never capture. Then, slowly, He lowered his hand, but his gaze remained unwavering. He turned, his face now a mask of cold fury, toward the stunned and terrified Mark and Chloe. This man, General Armstrong's voice was low, each word laced with contempt, is not just some old man looking for shelter. This man is the history you purport to celebrate in this museum. He took a step toward them, and they visibly recoiled. This is Sergeant Elias Vance. He fought at Normandy, he jumped into Holland, he endured the siege of Bastogne, when his company was surrounded, outnumbered, in sub-zero temperatures with barely any ammunition or food. And he didn't just endure. He fought with valor that legends are made of. The general's voice rose with each pronouncement, a tide of righteous anger. This man, he pointed a finger not at Elias, but at the space where Elias stood, as if indicating a sacred monument, was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross for extraordinary heroism when he single-handedly held off a German machine gun nest, allowing his pinned-down platoon to withdraw. He holds not one, but 2 silver stars for gallantry in action. And he carries the Purple Heart, earned when shrapnel tore through his leg while he was dragging 3 wounded comrades from a burning half-track under intense enemy fire. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink into the horrified silence. The valor and sacrifice wing? General Armstrong's voice dripped with scorn. Sergeant Vance lived valor and sacrifice. The very exhibits you guard so jealously are filled with the stories of men like him, men he fought alongside, men he saved, men he mourned. He turned back to Elias, his expression softening slightly. He came here to see a tribute to his friend, Sergeant Frank Miller, another hero of the 101st, whose photograph he hoped to find. Frank Miller, who died in his arms at Foy. Elias flinched at the name, a spasm of ancient grief crossing his face. The general noticed. His voice softened fractionally as he looked back at Elias, a deep empathy in his eyes, before hardening again as he faced the museum staff. And you presume to judge him by his coat? The museum director, Mr. Harrison, a portly man, in an impeccably tailored suit, had been alerted by the unusual commotion and the early unannounced arrival of his VIP guest. He hurried into the lobby, his face flushed, a welcoming smile plastered on, until he saw the scene, General Armstrong radiating fury, his 2 staff members looking like they were about to faint, and the old, unassuming man at the center of it all, now standing with a quiet, unshakable dignity. "General Armstrong, what on earth is happening? Is everything quite all right?" Harrison asked, his voice betraying his alarm. General Armstrong turned his steely gaze upon the director. "No, Director Harrison, everything is most certainly not all right." His voice was a low growl. One of this nation's most decorated combat veterans, a true American hero, was just subjected to humiliation and disrespect at the entrance of your institution. He was denied entry, accused of being a vagrant, and threatened with forcible removal by your employees. He gestured dismissively toward Mark and Chloe. Mark, desperate, found his voice, though it trembled uncontrollably. "Sir, General, I didn't know. He didn't say who he was. He just—" General Armstrong cut him off with a look that could freeze fire. "He didn't say who he was. And why should he, young man? Does honor require a name tag? Does valor announce itself with a trumpet? Or did you simply fail to see past a faded jacket and a few gray hairs? Did you ask him his story? Did you offer him the benefit of the doubt, a shred of common decency, of simple human respect? Or did you merely see what your own shallow prejudices wanted you to see?" Chloe had begun to weep silently, tears streaming down her pale face, the full weight of her callousness crashing down upon her. Mr. Harrison looked from the incandescent general to the quietly stoic Elias, and understanding, followed by profound horror and shame, dawned on his face. He turned to Mark and Chloe, his own voice now tight with anger. "You two, my office. Immediately. We will discuss your future employment at this museum, or lack thereof." He then turned to Elias, his expression one of deep, sincere contrition. "Sergeant Vance," he said, his voice filled with emotion, "on behalf of the National Military History Museum and myself personally, I offer you my deepest, most profound apologies. What happened here is inexcusable, a stain on our institution. Please, sir, allow us to make amends. You are our most honored guest. The entire museum, and especially the Valor and Sacrifice Wing, is yours to experience with our utmost gratitude and respect." General Armstrong placed a supportive hand on Elias's shoulder. "Sergeant Vance will be my personal guest for the tour of the wing he came to see, Director, and I trust that a comprehensive retraining program on respect, veteran sensitivity, and the dangers of superficial judgment will be implemented for all your staff, effective immediately." What followed was a quiet whirlwind of vindication. Elias Vance, no longer an unwanted outsider, but a celebrated hero, was personally escorted by General Armstrong and a deeply humbled museum director, Harrison, through the hallowed halls of the Valor and Sacrifice Wing. The very air seemed to part for them. Other patrons, many of whom had witnessed the earlier confrontation, watched in stunned silence, their expressions a mixture of awe and shame. Some veterans themselves discreetly wiped tears from their eyes. Inside the exhibit, the lighting was somber, respectful. Displays of weaponry, tattered flags, and personal effects from soldiers of past wars lay silent testament to unimaginable courage. General Armstrong, now acting more as a deferential guide than a superior officer, walked beside Elias, occasionally pointing out details, but mostly allowing the sergeant his own space to absorb, to remember. They came to a section dedicated to the 101st Airborne Division during the Battle of the Bulge, and there, on a wall of photographs depicting the grim, determined faces of young paratroopers in the frozen Ardennes, was a slightly blurred image of a younger Sergeant Frank Miller, a canteen in his hand. A ghost of a smile on his lips, Elias stopped. He reached out a trembling hand, his fingers gently tracing the outline of his friend's face on the cool glass. No words were spoken, none were needed. The general and the director stood back, witnessing a reunion that transcended time and loss. For Elias, the years melted away. He was back in the snow, the smell of cordite in the air, Frank's laughter echoing faintly in his memory. A single tear traced a path down his weathered cheek, a silent tribute to a bond forged in hellfire. Later, as they concluded the tour, Mr. Harrison assured Elias that Mark and Chloe had been suspended pending a full review, and that new museum-wide sensitivity training focusing on veterans and the importance of non-judgment would begin the following week. He also announced that Elias Vance would be given a lifetime honorary membership to the museum, and that his story, if he permitted, would be incorporated into their oral history project. Elias, overwhelmed but grateful, simply nodded. The apology was sincere. The changes he hoped would be lasting. The quiet affirmation he had sought had arrived in a way he could never have imagined, not as a whisper, but as a thunderclap of recognition. The echoes of that day resonated long after Elias Vance left the National Military History Museum. Not by bus this time, but in a car arranged by a grateful General Armstrong. The harsh words of dismissal had been replaced by expressions of profound respect, not just from the museum leadership, but from ordinary people who had witnessed the extraordinary turn of events. Some approached him as he left, shaking his hand, thanking him for his service, their eyes shining with admiration. Elias, a man of few words, accepted their gratitude with quiet humility. The vindication was not a source of triumph for him, but a balm on an old wound, a quiet acknowledgment that his sacrifices, and the sacrifices of so many like him, still mattered. The museum did indeed implement sweeping changes. Chloe, after a period of reflection and intensive retraining, returned to her post a changed young woman, her eyes now open to the stories hidden behind unassuming exteriors, Mark's. was not so fortunate. His tenure at the museum ended abruptly. A new plaque was eventually placed near the entrance of the Valor and Sacrifice wing, dedicated to the visible and invisible heroes among us. May we always honor their service with the respect they so profoundly earned. The central lesson of that day became a quiet mantra within the institution: never judge a book by its cover, for the most worn bindings often hold the most profound tales. True heroism isn't loud or ostentatious. It often walks silently among us, cloaked in humility, etched in the lines of a weathered face, beating in a heart that remembers the cost of freedom. Respect is not a privilege accorded by status or appearance, but a fundamental debt owed to character, to sacrifice, to the enduring strength of the human spirit. Months later, Elias was sometimes seen sitting on a park bench near his small apartment, holding a small, framed photograph the museum had gifted him. A clear print of Sergeant Frank Miller. A faint, peaceful smile would touch his lips. The world hadn't forgotten after all. Their silence holds stories of bravery we can only imagine. If you believe in honoring our hidden heroes, in ensuring their legacies are never dismissed or overlooked, subscribe to Hidden Sparks for more stories that demand to be told. Share this story if it moved your heart.